What is up, boys and girls? Welcome back. So, today we want to talk about karma. What the hell is karma, man? Karma to me is process. Karma to me is conditioned action. It's conditioning itself. Karma is the conditioning over the pure self or pure consciousness. Karma is time. Karma is memory. Karma is cyclical. It repeats itself. Breaking free from karma is finding your place in spontaneous action. Action that is not conditioned by memory, but arises from a deeper form of intelligence, a response to the needs of the moment without having to rely on a preset way of being or a predetermined path of action. Karma is predetermination. Spontaneity is closer to the truth. Spontaneity is the nature of consciousness once it becomes unconditioned. So the question arises, do we have free will or agency, or does everything arise spontaneously and we have no control over it? I'd respond to this question in two ways. Let's just say the person who is ignorant of their true nature, or for whom this clarity hasn't yet dawned, they operate completely out of their karmic makeup, their karmic conditioning. Whereas for the person for whom this clarity has dawned, they operate out of spontaneity. Now, both movements are spontaneous. However, for the person for whom the clarity hasn't dawned, the same spontaneity gets masked. It gets covered up by the karmic makeup. So the same unconditioned response gets conditioned by the karmic conditioning or makeup and gets enacted out into the world. Whereas for the unconditioned mind, the spontaneity is uncovered. So essentially, both movements are spontaneous. There is no moment of choice. Your life as it is now, or what takes place in your life, it couldn't be any other way. There is a sense that, oh, I could have, maybe I should have done it differently. But that's not possible. It's not possible. So that sense of freedom of will is a sense, but it's an illusion. I am doing is an illusion. And once this message is finally heard or received, there can be a greater sense of relaxation with the flow of experience. A lot of our suffering comes from the fact that we are identified with the action. We're identified with being the doer of our actions. Like breathing. Breathing is happening spontaneously, right? Even when you try to consciously control the breath, even that is arising spontaneously. I think the problem is that there is a split in most of our psychology. We think that there are certain actions that we trigger, we kickstart, and then there are certain actions or events that happen on the outside through natural causes or through the actions of other people. This is true, however, this framing is dualistic. It ignores the fact that even the actions of the person are also natural actions. So ultimately, it's a system of actions. It's a total system of actions. Even the actions arising from this organism are part of that system. And this system has no agency of its own outside of the system. It's part of the system. So just like when we think about earthquakes, for example, you wouldn't say the earthquake has free will, right? The earthquake is a natural movement within consciousness. Similarly, our thoughts, our emotions, our movements are spontaneous occurrences within the greater manifestation of consciousness. There is no individual doer. It's a agentless process. The entire universe is an agentless process. I hope I'm explaining this clearly. So even the process of feeling like a separate self, that's also an impersonal process. That is just arising in consciousness like a whirlpool in the ocean. You won't say, oh, the whirlpool decided to be a whirlpool. That doesn't make sense. You would say the whirlpool is what the ocean does from time to time. Similarly, j- just like the ocean can whirlpool, it can also unwhirlpool. No whirlpool lasts forever, right? So literally, the ego is like a mental whirlpool. It's a psychological whirlpool in the fabric of consciousness. And whether that would unwhirlpool, it's not up to any individual person, because there are no individuals. There is just everything. So the unpooling is also an impersonal process that nobody has any control over. This is not to say that, now here's a big problem in how these teachings are described in modern parlance. The problem is that somebody who is operating out of an personal sense of consciousness or egoic sense of consciousness might hear this and say, oh, everything is determined and it's not my choice, right? So it'll be a feeling of like just giving up. It'll be a feeling of just giving up, and that can become a shadow. That can become a defense mechanism. That can become a way of avoiding reality, right? So if the person has, let's say, negative tendencies or unconscious patterns of behavior, let's say, mistreating animals or mistreating somebody else, or consuming a drug or alcohol, anything that might be injurious to your health or the health of other people, the ego would say, oh, like this is not up to me. Everything is just an impersonal process. Even this is an impersonal process. That is true. That is an impersonal process. However, it's even the egos that hide behind this teaching, even that's an impersonal process. And so is the ego that doesn't hide behind this teaching, is also an impersonal process. But I just wanted to highlight that this can be a big tendency to avoid in yourself. It's as an ego, it's a much better position to have, to say that there are certain things that I can control, that are within the locus of my control, and then there are certain things that I cannot control. That's a very good teaching for the psychological self. The higher realization or teaching, it can be misused by the ego, like I suggested earlier. The higher teaching is that ultimately nothing is in my control. Even the things that feel like are in my control are not in my control, because I am part of that impersonal movement as well. So, but that cannot be understood rationally. So try this. On a practical level, have the Stoic ideal. I can control what I can control, and there are things I cannot control. But on an existential and intellectual level, have the understanding that ultimately, everything is just an impersonal movement within consciousness. Even what I do or how I respond is ultimately like physics, basically. Our lives are a lot like physics. They're governed by specific laws that cannot be broken, right? See, because if you're talking about the collective level right now, even somebody who is in poverty, for example, that situation arose because of a combination of collective, social, and personal characteristics, and also historical characteristics. The interplay, it's like systems theory essentially. That is not to say the situation cannot change. The situation can change, right? Change is life. Life evolves. Life itself wants change. It wants to grow. It wants to evolve. So let's say somebody institutes a new policy in the government, and that provides some relief to people below the poverty line. That will change the situation for the poor man or the poor woman, right? Or there is an evolutionary impulse from within the poor man saying like, okay, my own situation can be a lot better, so let me ask for help from my family members, let me get re-educated or whatever, right? So change can arise from the outside or the inside, but both are within the same unit, the same system, right? So the outside and the inside are not different, right? So ultimately, let's just call it the system for now. So imagine the individual and the collective are both embedded in the same system. Ultimately, it's the system that has agency. Although it would not be technically correct to say a system has agency, but for the time being, we'll say both are part of the same system. So the individual action also is guided by the systemic laws, and the collective action is also guided by the systemic laws, right? So that's why in a lot of teachings you say like whatever happens is God's will, right? That's what they're trying to say. God in those descriptions is the system. So why this is not seen is because these are transpersonal truths, and a person identified with personal consciousness cannot see past their own limitations. So they interpret their experience based on their own limitations. So you cannot choose to be enlightened because you're not choosing to be unenlightened. The best practice is to see the sense of separation within you. And by see, I mean not with your physical eyes. It's to have insight. It's to go within and see the root of separation within your psychology. The deeper root of separation is within our emotions, even though the start of the journey is usually intellectual and conceptual. The deeper aspects of them lie at the base of the psyche, which is emotion. That's why for me, like, spiritual paths differ. There are spiritual paths which emphasize the path of realization, so that tends to be a lot more intellectual and spiritual, insight oriented. The other is the path of embodiment, which tends to be more emotional and action oriented. So embodiment is bhakti yoga and karma yoga, and the path of realization is Raja Yoga and Jnana Yoga. So the path of meditation and the path of the intellect, and the path of devotion and the path of action. So these are the four different paths. If you look at Christianity, for example, that's the path of embodiment. Christ talked a lot about mercy, kindness, compassion. He also talked about how to act. He himself was like a social activist, right? A very engaged path. Whereas the Buddha emphasized the path of realization. It was very intellectual. You read Nagarjuna, you read all these Buddhist texts which have a rich tapestry, a conceptual tapestry, frameworks for what reality is. You don't see the same thing in Christianity. It is there, but it's more allegorical. It is more symbolic. It's less precise intellectually. That's why, like, scientists like to follow Buddhism a lot more. Scientists are intellectual people, right? Also, Buddha emphasized the path of wisdom, the path of detachment, the path of moving away, beyond, going even beyond thought itself. So I could talk about this all day, okay? I could continue talking about this for hours, but unfortunately at some point we have to stop. So I'm thinking I'll record more videos on different topics for you to see, experiment with, and imbibe if it works for you, discard if it doesn't work for you.